Echoes of guilt. Mark Thompson sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of him. He had been going over the same case file for hours now, trying to make sense of the tangled web of clues and evidence. As a detective in the Amsterdam Police Department, he had seen his fair share of grisly murders and violent crimes, but this one was different. It was personal. The victim was a young woman named Sarah, and she had been found brutally murdered in her apartment just a few days ago. Mark had been the first on the scene, and the sight of her lifeless body still haunted him. He had known Sarah for years, and they had even been romantically involved for a brief period of time. He couldn't shake the feeling that he could have done something to prevent her death. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He turned to see his partner, Lisa, standing in the doorway. "Hey, Mark," she said. "We've got a lead on the case. The lab just finished processing the fingerprints from the crime scene, and they've got a match." Mark sat up straight in his chair, his heart racing. "Who is it?" "His name is Simon Holland," Lisa said. "He's got a criminal record for assault and battery, but nothing that would suggest he's capable of something like this." "Let's bring him in for questioning," Mark said, standing up from his desk. As they drove to Simon's last known address, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Simon's criminal record didn't match the level of violence seen in Sarah's murder, and the fingerprints seemed too obvious to be the work of a seasoned criminal. When they arrived at Simon's apartment, they found the door slightly ajar. Mark and Lisa exchanged a glance before cautiously entering, their guns drawn. Inside, they found Simon sitting at his kitchen table, a look of shock and confusion on his face. "Simon Holland?" Mark asked, keeping his gun trained on the man. "Yes, that's me," Simon said, his voice trembling. "What's going on? Why are you here?" "We're here to ask you a few questions about Sarah," Mark said. Simon's face turned white as a sheet. "Sarah? What about Sarah?" Mark could see that Simon was genuinely surprised and shocked. He lowered his gun and said, "Simon, I think you should come with us to the station." As they drove back to the station, Mark couldn't shake off the feeling that Simon was not the killer. He had a gut feeling that they were missing something, and that the real killer was still out there, somewhere. When they arrived at the station, Simon was taken into an interrogation room while Mark and Lisa watched through a two-way mirror. As they watched Simon being questioned, Mark's phone rang. It was the coroner's office, and they had some new information about the victim. Mark excused himself from the observation room and answered the phone. The coroner's voice was grave as he spoke. "Mark, I think you should come down to the morgue. We've just finished the victim's autopsy, and there's something you should see." Mark's heart sank as he hung up the phone. He knew that whatever the coroner had found, it would change everything. As Mark raced to the morgue, his mind was racing with possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to the truth, but that it would come at a great cost. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched. When he arrived at the morgue, the coroner was waiting for him. "Mark, I think you should take a look at this," he said, leading Mark to the examination room. On the table in front of him was Sarah's body, but something was different. The bruises and lacerations that had been present on her body at the crime scene were gone, replaced by a series of small puncture wounds. Mark's heart sank as he realized what this meant. "She was drugged," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The coroner nodded. "We found traces of a powerful sedative in her system. It would have rendered her unconscious, unable to defend herself." Mark's mind was racing as he tried to piece together the new information. If Sarah had been drugged, then the killer must have been someone she knew and trusted. But who could be capable of such a heinous act? Mark left the morgue and went back to the station, where Simon was still being held for questioning. As he walked past the interrogation room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Simon was not the killer. He had a gut feeling that they were missing something, and that the real killer was still out there, somewhere. Mark went to his office and began going over the case file again, looking for any clues or evidence that he may have missed. As he was going through the evidence, he came across a photo of Sarah taken on the night of her murder. In the background, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was too far away to be clearly seen, but something about it caught Mark's attention. He enlarged the photo and studied it closely. The figure was wearing a dark hooded jacket, and had a familiar gait. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he realized who the figure was. He grabbed his coat and headed out of the station, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. He knew that he was walking into a dangerous situation, but he had to know for sure if his suspicions were correct. As he made his way to the address he had for the figure in the photo, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but there was no one there. When he arrived at the address, he found the door slightly ajar. He cautiously entered, his gun drawn. Inside, he found the figure from the photo sitting at a kitchen table, a look of shock and confusion on his face. It was Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Ryan. "Ryan, what are you doing here?" Mark asked, keeping his gun trained on the man. "I could ask you the same thing," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "Why are you here?" Mark could see that Ryan was genuinely surprised and shocked. But he knew that he couldn't let his guard down. "Ryan, I think you should come with me to the station," Mark said. As they left the apartment, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had finally found the killer. But at the same time, he knew that the truth had come at a great cost. And he couldn't shake off the feeling that his life would never be the same again. Mark and Ryan arrived at the station, where Ryan was taken into an interrogation room. Mark sat down in the observation room with Lisa, watching as the interrogator began questioning Ryan. As the interrogation went on, Mark could see that Ryan was becoming increasingly agitated and defensive. He kept insisting that he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder and that he had an alibi for the night in question. But something in the way he was acting made Mark suspicious. He couldn't shake off the feeling that Ryan was hiding something. After a few hours of questioning, Ryan finally broke down and confessed to the murder. He had been jealous of Sarah's new relationship and had drugged her with the intention of confronting her about it. But things had escalated and he had ended up killing her in a fit of rage. Mark felt a wave of disgust and anger wash over him as he listened to Ryan's confession. He couldn't believe that someone he had considered a friend could be capable of such a heinous act. He had to remind himself that Ryan was a criminal now, and that he had to be held accountable for his actions. With Ryan's confession, the case was finally solved, but Mark couldn't shake off the feeling that he had lost something in the process. He had lost a friend, and he had lost a part of himself in the process of solving the case. He couldn't help but wonder if there was something he could have done differently, if only he had seen the signs earlier. But he knew that he couldn't change the past and he had to move on. He would never forget Sarah, but he had to focus on the future and the cases that are waiting for him. He put on his coat and left the station, ready to take on the next case and the next challenge. Thanks for listening.